Arizona Territory, 1883. The unforgiving summer sun beat down on Whispering Pines, a town clinging to existence at the edge of civilization, where law was negotiated daily between six-shooters and survival hung on the strength of a man's resolve. 25-year-old Ethan Jameson pulled his hat lower, shielding his eyes from the glare as he guided his stallion down the dusty main street. 5 years of driving cattle across 3 states had hardened him like leather left too long in the sun, but the scars that truly defined him remained hidden beneath his weathered exterior. "A man rides alone in this country," he muttered to himself, a mantra repeated so often it had become gospel truth. Attachment is just another word for vulnerability. Ethan's face, though youthful, carried the quiet intensity of someone who'd seen too much too young. His lean frame spoke of hard work and harder living, but there remained something in his clear blue eyes that the frontier hadn't yet claimed, a reluctant softness he fought daily to suppress. The revolver at his hip had become both companion and conscience since the day outlaws had raided his family's homestead, leaving him the sole survivor at 17. Trust, he'd learned, was a luxury that got men killed in the untamed West. What Ethan wanted was simple: complete the cattle drive, collect his pay, and purchase enough land to start his own ranch, somewhere isolated where he answered to no one. What he needed, though he'd deny it until his dying breath, was to fill the hollowness that echoed in his chest each night as he stared at stars too numerous to count and too distant to touch. At the far end of town stood Zimmerman's General Store, the last place to resupply before the long stretch of nothing that separated Whispering Pines from the next outpost of humanity. Ethan dismounted, his boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. He secured his horse to the hitching post with practiced efficiency and stepped onto the worn wooden porch. The store's interior was cool and dim after the harsh brilliance outside. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from flour sacks to ammunition, tools to remedies. Behind the counter stood Harold Zimmerman, a man whose body had grown as wide as his merchandise selection. He nodded at Ethan, recognition but not quite welcome in the gesture. "Jameson, thought you'd be halfway to Colorado by now." Trail boss lost 30 head crossing the Salt River. "We're delayed 2 days while they recover." Ethan's voice was low, economical with words. A movement near the back of the store caught his attention. A young woman stood on tiptoes, struggling to reach canned goods on a high shelf. Her dress, a simple blue calico that had seen better days, was patched but meticulously clean. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical braid that reached halfway down her back, with wisps escaping to frame a face that made Ethan pause mid-stride. There was nothing extraordinary about her features, at least nothing that would turn heads in the saloons or cause whispers among the town's gossips. Yet something in the determined set of her jaw and the intelligent gleam in her eyes made it impossible for him to look away. "Sarah," Harold called out, his tone somewhere between impatience and resignation. "Stop fussing with those cans and help this customer." The young woman Sarah turned, and for a moment her eyes met Ethan's. He felt an uncomfortable jolt, as though she could see straight through to the truths he'd buried beneath years of solitude. "Yes, Uncle Harold." She climbed down from her perch and approached the counter, smoothing her apron with work-roughened hands. "What can I help you with, sir?" Before Ethan could answer, the door burst open. 3 trail hands from his own drive stumbled in, already half-drunk despite the early hour. "Well, if it ain't the quiet man himself," the tallest one, Jenkins, called out. "Come to spend your money on something other than bullets for once." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Just supplies." Jenkins sauntered closer, whiskey heavy on his breath. "Maybe you should spend some of that pay on a little companionship, might loosen you up." His gaze slid to Sarah, who had gone very still behind the counter, though pickings are slim in this town. "Nothing but plain Janes and—" "That's enough." Ethan's voice was quiet but carried the unmistakable edge of threat. Jenkins held up his hands in mock surrender. "No offense meant. Just thinking our trail boss here could use some female attention." He turned to Sarah with an exaggerated bow. "No insult to you, miss, though I reckon even Jameson here ain't desperate enough to—" The rest of his words were cut off as Ethan's hand closed around his collar, yanking him backward toward the door. "Hey, what the—" Outside now, Ethan propelled the startled cowhand through the doorway, his 2 companions following in confused silence. On the porch, he released Jenkins with a firm shove. "You're drunk. Go sober up before the boss sees you." Jenkins straightened his shirt, anger and embarrassment fighting for dominance on his flushed face. Didn't figure you for a gentleman, Jameson. Especially not for some shop girl nobody even looks twice at. Ethan's hand moved instinctively to his holster. Last warning. Something in his expression must have penetrated Jenkins' alcohol-fogged mind, because the man backed down, muttering curses as he and his friends retreated toward the saloon. When Ethan returned to the store, Sarah was arranging items on the counter with quick, efficient movements, her eyes downcast. 20 years old at most, he guessed, noting the youth still present in her features despite the premature lines of worry at the corners of her eyes. "I apologize for that," he said stiffly. "No need." Her voice was soft but not timid. "I'm quite used to being the invisible Zimmerman." A small, self-deprecating smile curved her lips as she looked up. "What supplies do you need, Mr. Jameson?" The fact that she knew his name without introduction caught him off guard. He rattled off his list: coffee, ammunition, jerky, tobacco, while she gathered each item with quiet competence. "Heading north," she asked, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. "Colorado, delivering 2,000 head to the railroad." She nodded, tallying his purchases in a leather-bound ledger with neat, precise handwriting. "That's 37 miles of open country with no water between here and Cottonwood Creek. The spring at Eagle Canyon dried up last month." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You know the territory." "I know maps," she shrugged. "Uncle Harold keeps the land surveys here. I read them when the store is quiet." She hesitated, then added, "which is most of the time." There was something disarming about her honesty. Ethan found himself lingering at the counter longer than necessary, watching her hands as they wrapped his purchases in brown paper. "Will there be anything else?" she asked, tying the final package with string. Before he could answer, a commotion erupted outside: shouts, the thunder of hooves, and then a gunshot that shattered the afternoon quiet. Ethan was through the door in an instant, revolver drawn. What he saw froze his blood. 3 riders in dusty black coats were galloping down the main street, firing indiscriminately. Behind them, the bank door stood open, and a body lay sprawled on the boardwalk outside. "Bank robbery," someone shouted, stating the obvious as townsfolk scattered for cover. Ethan's instinct screamed at him to take shelter, to protect himself as he always had. But then he saw a small child frozen in terror in the middle of the street, directly in the path of the oncoming riders. Without conscious thought, he was running, crossing the distance in desperate strides as the thundering hooves grew closer. He scooped the boy up and dove for the shelter of a water trough as bullets splintered the wood around them. Pain exploded in his left shoulder, a graze, not a direct hit but enough to draw blood. The outlaws raced past, more concerned with escape than accuracy. Ethan raised his revolver, got off 2 shots, and was rewarded with a cry of pain as one rider clutched his arm. But they were quickly out of range, dust clouds marking their retreat. As the chaos subsided, Ethan returned the sobbing child to his frantic mother. The town was already gathering around the fallen bank teller, whose life had bled out into the dirt of Whispering Pines. Ethan started back toward the general store, pressing a handkerchief to his wounded shoulder, only to find Sarah Zimmerman already hurrying toward him, a determined set to her jaw and a medical kit in her hands. "You're bleeding," she said simply. "It's nothing." "It's a bullet wound." She took his arm with surprising authority. "And if you think I'm going to let you ride out of here with an untreated wound that could fester and kill you 50 miles from nowhere, you're sorely mistaken." Too surprised by her sudden transformation from quiet shop girl to commanding healer, Ethan allowed himself to be led back to the store's rear room, where she pushed him onto a wooden chair and began cutting away his shirt sleeve with practiced efficiency. "That was either very brave or very foolish," she commented as she cleaned the wound with whiskey that stung worse than the bullet. Ethan gritted his teeth against the pain. "Most brave things are foolish. And most foolish things aren't brave at all." Her hands were gentle despite her blunt words. "But what you did, that child would be dead if not for you." Her proximity was unsettling. Ethan could smell the faint lavender of her soap, could see the delicate curve of her neck as she bent over his wound. It had been years since he'd been this close to a woman who wasn't asking for payment afterward. "How do you know about treating gunshot wounds?" he asked, partly to distract himself from her touch. Sarah's eyes remained focused on her work as she threaded a needle. "My father was a doctor in St. Louis before we came west. He taught me what he could before the consumption took him." She paused, needle poised. "This will hurt." It did, but Ethan remained stoically silent as she stitched the wound with small, neat sutures. When she'd finished and was wrapping a clean bandage around his shoulder, he found himself studying her face, the dusting of freckles across her nose, the determined set of her mouth, the intelligent warmth in her hazel eyes. "Thank you," he said when she'd finished. "You're welcome." She hesitated, then added, "The trail boss, Mr. Callahan, he's already paid for your supplies, said to tell you they're moving out at first light with or without you." Ethan nodded, rising from the chair. The room suddenly seemed too small, too intimate. "I should go." Sarah stepped back, creating distance between them. "Yes, you should." But then she added, "Though that shoulder needs watching for infection. You should have someone check the dressing tomorrow." "I'll manage." He'd always managed alone. She studied him for a long moment, then turned away to pack up her medical supplies. "Of course you will. Men like you always do." Something in her tone, not quite dismissal, not quite challenge, made him pause at the door. "What do you mean, men like me?" Sarah looked up, and the directness of her gaze was unsettling. "Men who believe being alone makes them strong." The words struck too close to the truth he'd built his life around. Ethan left without responding, but as he rode back to the cattle camp, her observation echoed in his mind, along with the memory of gentle hands tending his wound and eyes that seemed to see through the barriers he'd so carefully constructed. Dawn broke over the eastern mountains as the trail drive prepared to move out. Ethan, his shoulder throbbing despite the willow bark tea he'd drunk for the pain, tightened the cinch on his saddle. "Thought we'd lost you to that pretty nurse," Callahan, the trail boss, remarked as he walked past. "She's not a nurse," Ethan replied automatically, "just the storekeeper's niece." Callahan's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "Must have made quite an impression for you to remember that distinction." Before Ethan could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much, a commotion at the edge of camp caught their attention. A rider was approaching at speed, and as they watched, the figure resolved into none other than Sarah Zimmerman herself, astride a sturdy brown mare and wearing a divided riding skirt that shocked Ethan almost as much as her unexpected appearance. She reined in before them, slightly breathless but composed. "Mr. Callahan, I need to speak with you urgently." The trail boss removed his hat. "Miss Zimmerman, this is an unexpected pleasure." "It's not a social call." She dismounted in one fluid motion that spoke of far more experience with horses than Ethan would have guessed. "3 riders came through town last night. They were asking about your herd, specifically about when you'd be moving out and which route you'd be taking." Callahan's expression darkened. "The bank robbers?" "No," Sarah shook her head. "Different men. Well-dressed, they claimed to be cattle buyers, but something didn't seem right. They were too interested in your security arrangements, how many men you had." "Rustlers," Ethan said, the pieces falling into place. "They're planning to hit us in the Badlands, where we'll be spread thin." Callahan swore under his breath. "We can't delay any longer. We've got contracts to meet." "There's another way," Sarah said. "An old Apache trail that skirts the Badlands entirely. It adds a day to the journey, but it's well-watered and defensible." Both men stared at her in surprise. "How do you know about an Apache trail?" Callahan demanded. "I told you," she said, looking directly at Ethan. "I read maps, and I listened to people, especially people others tend to overlook, like the old medicine woman who trades herbs at our store and drew me this." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket and handed it to Callahan. The trail boss studied the crude map, his expression shifting from skepticism to grudging respect. "This could work." He looked up at Sarah. "Miss Zimmerman, you've done us a great service riding out here. We're in your debt." She nodded acknowledgement, but her eyes sought Ethan's. "I also brought fresh bandages and a poultice for Mr. Jameson's wound. It should be redressed." Callahan glanced between them, amusement crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Well then, I'll leave you to your doctoring, Miss Zimmerman. Jameson, we move out in 30 minutes. He walked away, already calling orders to the other drovers. Left alone with Sarah, Ethan found himself uncharacteristically at a loss for words. "You didn't have to ride all this way." "I know," she reached for his injured arm with the same confident authority she'd shown the day before. "Remove your shirt, please." It was not a request that allowed for refusal. Awkwardly, Ethan shrugged out of his shirt, acutely aware of her proximity as she unwound the bandage to reveal the angry red wound beneath. "It's not infected," she pronounced after careful examination. But it could still turn if not properly cared for. Her fingers were cool against his heated skin as she applied a green paste that smelled of herbs and pine. "Why did you really come?" he asked as she worked. Sarah's hands stilled momentarily. "I told you, the rustlers. You could have sent anyone with that message." He turned to face her, their faces uncomfortably close. "Why you?" Her eyes met his, unflinching. "Because I wanted to make sure you didn't die of stubbornness and infection 50 miles from nowhere." "You don't even know me." "I know enough," she resumed, bandaging his shoulder. "I know you ran into gunfire to save a child yesterday when most men would have taken cover. I know you defended my honor when it would have been easier to laugh along with your friends." "They're not my friends." "That's my point exactly." She secured the bandage with a neat knot. "You keep everyone at a distance. Even now, you're trying to understand why someone you consider a stranger would ride 10 miles at dawn to help you." Her insight was unsettling. Ethan stepped back, reclaiming his shirt. "And have you figured out the answer?" Sarah gathered her medical supplies with deliberate care. "Perhaps I recognize a kindred spirit, someone else who knows what it's like to be overlooked." Before he could respond, Callahan's voice rang out across the camp. "Mount up, we're moving out." Sarah handed Ethan a small cloth bundle, more poultice and clean bandages, change them daily. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for the conflicting emotions her presence stirred in him. "You should get back to town before your uncle misses you." A smile touched her lips. "Uncle Harold believes I'm delivering an order to the Wilkins farm. I have until noon before he expects me back." Ethan frowned. "It's dangerous country to ride alone." "Then perhaps I should ride with your herd until the Cottonwood Creek turnoff." Her smile widened at his surprise. "Unless you think a cattle drive is no place for a woman." The challenge in her eyes stirred something in Ethan he'd thought long dormant, a desire to match wits with someone who could keep pace. "It's your neck," he finally said, though the gruffness in his voice couldn't quite mask the reluctant admiration underneath. For the next several hours, Sarah Zimmerman proved herself far more at home on the trail than anyone would have guessed. She rode with the easy confidence of someone raised in the saddle, handled her mare with subtle skill, and conversed intelligently with the trail hands about everything from weather patterns to the best way to ford the shallow rivers that crisscrossed the territory. Ethan, riding point ahead of the herd, found his gaze continually drawn back to her. She'd secured her hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but tendrils escaped to dance in the wind. The morning sun caught the golden highlights in her brown locks, and occasionally, when she laughed at something one of the men said, the sound carried to him like music rarely heard in these harsh lands. At midday, when they stopped briefly to water the cattle, Sarah rode up beside him at the creek's edge. "Your men seem surprised that a shop girl knows how to ride," she observed, dismounting to let her horse drink. "You're full of surprises," Ethan admitted, wincing slightly as he stretched his injured arm. "People often are if you take the time to look beyond first impressions." She studied him with those perceptive eyes. "What about you, Ethan Jameson? What surprises are you hiding beneath that solitary exterior?" The directness of her question and her use of his first name caught him off guard. For a moment, he considered deflecting with his usual reticence, but something about her earnest gaze made him answer truthfully. "I used to draw when I was younger." It was a confession he hadn't made to anyone in years. Landscapes mostly, the way the light falls on the mountains at sunset or how mist clings to river valleys at dawn. Sarah's face brightened with genuine interest. "Do you still draw?" "No," he looked away, focusing on the herd gathering at the water's edge. "Left my sketchbooks behind when outlaws killed my family and burned our homestead. Some things don't survive the realities of this country." "I'm sorry about your family." Her voice was gentle, but she didn't offer the usual platitudes. Instead, she asked, "What would you draw now if you could?" The question stayed with him long after they'd parted ways at Cottonwood Creek, where Sarah turned back toward Whispering Pines with a simple goodbye and a reminder to change his bandages. What would he draw now? The question haunted him as the cattle drive continued northward, through narrow canyons and across open grasslands. The answer, though he tried to deny it, took shape in his mind during the long nights on watch. He would draw Sarah Zimmerman as she'd looked that morning, sunlight catching in her hair, intelligence and challenge bright in her eyes, a woman overlooked by most but impossible for him to forget. 2 weeks later, the cattle drive reached its destination, the railroad depot at Silver Junction, Colorado. The cattle were counted, payment was made, and the drovers prepared for the journey home or onward to new employment. Ethan, his shoulder nearly healed thanks to Sarah's poultice and his diligent care, found himself facing a decision he hadn't anticipated. Staying on for the return trip, Callahan asked as they settled accounts in the depot office. Ethan hesitated. "I'm not sure." The trail boss regarded him with knowing eyes. "Got something pulling you elsewhere, or perhaps someone?" Ethan didn't answer directly. "Thought I might use some of my pay to buy land. Start my own place." "Good grazing southeast of Whispering Pines," Callahan observed casually. "Plenty of water, decent soil. Man could build something there with the right partner." That night, as the other drovers celebrated in the town's saloons, Ethan sat alone in his hotel room, a newly purchased sketchbook open on his lap. His first attempts were clumsy, his fingers remembering the motions slowly. But gradually the image took shape, a young woman with intelligent eyes and a determined set to her jaw, reaching for something just beyond her grasp. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like recognizing a truth he'd been avoiding since that day in the general store. 3 days later, he rode back into Whispering Pines alone, his saddlebags heavier with his pay and his heart lighter with purpose than when he'd left. Zimmerman's general store looked exactly as he remembered it. Ethan dismounted, took a breath to steady himself, and stepped inside. The familiar sense of coffee, leather, and dried goods greeted him. Behind the counter stood Harold Zimmerman, who looked up with mild surprise. "Jameson. Didn't expect to see you back so soon." "Is Sarah here?" Ethan asked, dispensing with preliminaries. Harold's eyebrows rose. "She's at the schoolhouse, teaching the Wilkins children their letters." Schoolhouse. Ethan hadn't known she was a teacher as well as a shopkeeper. 3 days a week, Harold shrugged. "Town can't afford a proper teacher yet, but Sarah's educated, does it for almost nothing." There was grudging pride beneath his matter-of-fact tone. Ethan nodded his thanks and turned to leave, but Harold's voice stopped him. "Jameson." The older man's expression had turned serious. "Sarah's not like most girls around here, books and ideas in her head. Had offers, not many, but enough. Turned them all down flat." "I'm not making an offer," Ethan said, though the thought had crossed his mind more than once on the long ride back. "Good," Harold returned to his ledger. "Because if you were, I'd tell you she deserves someone who sees what she's worth, not just another drifter passing through." The rebuke stung, not least because it echoed Ethan's own doubts. What did he have to offer someone like Sarah? A lifetime of running from attachments had left him ill-equipped for the very thing he now found himself wanting. The schoolhouse was a small, whitewashed building at the edge of town. As Ethan approached, the sounds of children's voices reciting multiplication tables drifted through the open windows. He dismounted, suddenly uncertain, and tied his horse to the hitching post. Through the window, he could see Sarah standing before a group of children ranging from 5 to perhaps 12 years old. She wore a simple green dress that complemented her brown hair, which was pinned up more formally than he'd seen before. Her expression was animated as she guided her pupils through their lessons, patience and enthusiasm evident in every gesture. Ethan remained outside, watching, unwilling to interrupt. When the lesson concluded and the children filed out, eyeing him curiously as they passed, he finally entered the small building. Sarah was erasing chalk figures from the blackboard, her back to the door. "Did you forget something, Emma?" she asked without turning. "Not Emma," Ethan said. She whirled around, chalk dust clouding the air between them. For a moment she simply stared, her expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite name. "Ethan." She set down the eraser, composing herself. "I didn't expect to see you again." "I didn't expect to come back." He took a step forward, then stopped, suddenly aware of the gulf between the careful speech of a schoolteacher and his own rough trail manners. "Your uncle said I might find you here." "Yes, well," she gestured to the modest schoolroom. "Someone needs to teach the children, and I have more education than most in town." A slight flush colored her cheeks. "Not that it's much to boast about, just what my father taught me and what I've learned from books." "It's impressive," Ethan said with genuine admiration. "Teaching, healing, reading maps that save cattle herds. You're quite remarkable, Sarah Zimmerman." Her blush deepened. "Hardly remarkable, just useful, I suppose." "Was there something you needed? Your shoulder?" "My shoulder's fine." He unconsciously touched the nearly healed wound. thanks to your care." An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with unasked questions. "Why did you come back, Ethan?" Sarah finally asked, direct as always. He'd rehearsed various answers during his journey, but now they all seemed inadequate. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and withdrew the sketchbook. "I bought this in Colorado," he said, holding it out to her. "First one I've owned since I was 17. Sarah took it hesitantly, opening to the first page where his initial drawing of her remained. Her eyes widened as she turned the pages, revealing sketch after sketch: Sarah at the creek, Sarah riding alongside the herd, Sarah as he remembered her that first day in the store, reaching for something just beyond her grasp. "You drew these," she whispered, "all of me." "You asked what I would draw now if I could," he said simply. "This is my answer." She closed the book carefully, her expression guarded. "I don't understand." "You barely know me." "I know enough," he said, echoing her words from weeks before. "I know you're intelligent, brave, and kind. I know you see people really see them when others look right past. And I know that meeting you made me question everything I've believed about surviving alone in this country." Sarah's gaze searched his face, looking for deception or mockery, but finding only earnest truth. "What are you saying, Ethan?" He took a deep breath. "I'm saying I bought land, 100 acres southeast of town with good water and better grazing. I'm saying I'm staying, building something permanent for the first time since I lost my family." He stepped closer. "And I'm saying I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing." For a long moment, Sarah didn't respond, and Ethan felt a cold tendril of doubt curl through his chest. Perhaps he'd misread everything. Perhaps her kindness had been nothing more than her nature, not particular to him at all. But then she smiled, a slow unfurling of joy that transformed her entire face. "I think I'd like that very much, Ethan Jameson." The relief that flooded him was so intense it was almost physical. But before he could respond, the schoolhouse door burst open, and a breathless boy of about 10 rushed in. "Miss Zimmerman, come quick, there's trouble at the store." The peace of the moment shattered. Ethan and Sarah exchanged one alarmed glance before racing out of the schoolhouse and toward the center of town. As they approached Zimmerman's store, the cause of the commotion became clear. 3 men on horseback were outside, and one had Harold Zimmerman by the collar, dragging him into the street. With a jolt of recognition, Ethan realized he knew these men. They were the bank robbers who had shot through town weeks earlier, the same ones who had wounded him. And now they had returned. "That's him," the largest of the 3 shouted, pointing at Ethan, "the one who shot Mercer." Sarah's hand found Ethan's arm. "The bank robbers," she whispered. "They must have followed the trail drive back." Ethan gently moved her behind him, his mind racing through options. "Stay here." "No," her grip on his arm tightened. "That's my uncle." "We've been looking for you, Cowboy," the leader called out. "Nobody shoots one of my men and lives to boast about it." Harold struggled in the man's grasp. "Let me go, I don't even know what you're talking about." "Shut up, old man," the outlaw shoved Harold roughly to the ground. "This is between us and the hero here." A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, but no one moved to interfere. The sheriff, Ethan knew, was 2 days' ride away, dealing with trouble at a mining camp. There would be no help coming. "Let him go," Ethan called, stepping forward. "Your quarrel's with me." The leader grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Brave words, but I think we'll take more than just satisfaction for Mercer's arm. I think we'll help ourselves to whatever's in that store, and maybe take the girl too for our trouble." At the threat to Sarah, something cold and deadly settled in Ethan's chest. "That won't happen." The 3 outlaws spread out slightly, hands hovering near their weapons. The leader's grin widened. "And who's going to stop us? You alone against the 3 of us." "Not alone," came a firm voice from behind Ethan. Sarah had stepped up beside him, a rifle in her hands that she must have retrieved from somewhere nearby. She held it with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. The leader's expression darkened. "Put that down, girl, before you hurt yourself." "I suggest you leave," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the danger, "before someone gets hurt who deserves it." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the outlaw to the left made his move, hand darting for his revolver. Ethan drew faster, his shot catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him backward. Almost simultaneously, Sarah fired, the rifle's report deafening in the confined street. Her bullet struck the ground at the leader's feet, close enough to make him jump. "The next one won't be a warning," she said calmly, working the lever to chamber another round. The leader's face contorted with rage, but before he could act, more townspeople appeared, armed with whatever weapons they had, shotguns, revolvers, even pitchforks. The odds had shifted dramatically. "This isn't over," the leader snarled, backing toward his horse. He and his remaining uninjured companion grabbed their wounded friend and retreated, galloping out of town in a cloud of dust. In the aftermath, as the townspeople helped Harold to his feet and exclaimed over Sarah's marksmanship, Ethan found himself staring at her with newfound appreciation. She caught his gaze and raised an eyebrow in question. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked quietly. A smile played at the corners of her mouth. "My father believed women should know how to protect themselves, and Uncle Harold insists I practice weekly." She lowered the rifle. "Did you think I was just a shopkeeper's niece who read maps?" "I think," Ethan said, taking her hand, "that I have a great deal more to learn about you, Sarah Zimmerman." The incident with the outlaws changed something fundamental in Whispering Pines. Where once the town had largely overlooked Sarah as merely Harold's plain, bookish niece, now she was the subject of admiration and respect. Her quiet competence, previously taken for granted, was suddenly recognized as the valuable asset it had always been. For Ethan, the change was even more profound. The man who had prided himself on needing no one found himself eagerly anticipating each moment in Sarah's company. Their courtship progressed with a steady certainty that surprised them both. 3 nights a week, after Sarah finished teaching, Ethan would escort her on walks through town or rides to his new property, where a small cabin was taking shape under his hands. On a golden afternoon in late autumn, they sat together on the porch of his nearly completed cabin, looking out over the land that would soon support his first herd of cattle. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, her hand resting lightly in his. "You've accomplished so much in just a few months." "I had motivation," Ethan squeezed her fingers gently, "and help." Indeed, many in town had assisted with the cabin raising, grateful for his and Sarah's stand against the outlaws. Even Harold Zimmerman had contributed, supplying materials at cost and offering gruff advice about the best timber for roofing. "I have something for you," Ethan said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small wooden box carved with delicate wildflowers. "I made it myself." Sarah took the box with reverent hands, tracing the carvings with her fingertips. "It's exquisite." She opened it to find a simple gold ring nestled inside. "Ethan." "I know it's not fancy," he said quickly, "not like what you might have had back east, but—" "It's perfect," she cut him off, her eyes shining. "Absolutely perfect." "I can't offer you an easy life," Ethan continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Ranching is hard work and this country is still wild, but I can promise you this. You will never be overlooked or undervalued, not for a single day." "Are you asking me to marry you, Ethan Jameson?" Sarah's voice was teasing, but her eyes were serious. "I am." He took both her hands in his. "I came west believing a man rides alone in this country. That attachment was just another word for vulnerability. You proved me wrong, Sarah. You showed me that real strength comes from connection, not isolation." Tears gathered in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Yes, of course, yes." They were married on Christmas Day, 1883, in the same schoolhouse where Ethan had found Sarah months before. The small building was transformed with evergreen boughs and candles, and everyone in Whispering Pines attended. Even crusty old miners who hadn't set foot in town for years came to witness the union of the quiet cowboy and the girl who had saved their town. Harold Zimmerman gave his niece away with surprising emotion. His usual gruffness softened as he placed her hand in Ethan's. Sarah wore a dress of deep blue velvet, a wedding gift from the town's ladies, who had sewn it in secret, and flowers woven into her brown hair, which fell loose past her shoulders in a cascade of soft waves. As they spoke their vows, Ethan looked into the eyes of the woman everyone had once overlooked and saw his future reflected there. Not a lonely existence of mere survival, but a rich life filled with purpose, partnership, and love. Later that evening, as they danced beneath lantern light in the town hall, Ethan held his bride close and whispered, "I never believed I could find this kind of happiness, especially not in such a harsh land." Sarah's arms tightened around his neck. "Perhaps it's not the land that's harsh or gentle, but what we bring to it. You brought your courage and your hidden artist's heart. I brought my books and my determination to see beyond surfaces." And together, Ethan asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear her say it. Her smile, tender and certain, was for him alone. Together, we bring love to a place where it seemed impossible. What could be more unexpected or more perfect than that? As winter melted into spring, the Jameson ranch flourished. The first calves were born, a vegetable garden took root beside the cabin, and Sarah started a small school on their property for the children of neighboring homesteaders. The woman everyone had once overlooked became the heart of a growing community, while the cowboy who had vowed to ride alone found himself surrounded by the family he had never dared to dream of. And on quiet evenings when the work was done, Ethan would often take out his sketchbook and draw his wife as she read by lamplight or gazed out over their land, no longer reaching for something beyond her grasp, but holding firmly to the life they had built together in the wild, beautiful country they both had come to love.